The room they put me in had a window that faced a parking lot. Not a garden, not a courtyard, a parking lot, with a dumpster at the far end and a handicapped space that was never empty. I sat on the edge of a narrow bed with a plastic mattress cover that crinkled every time I moved, and I thought about how my mother had chosen the flowers for my grandmother's dining table every Sunday for 20 years. White hydrangeas. Always white. She said they looked clean. I thought about that word, clean, and what it meant in my family, and whether a daughter who asked too many questions about a will ever looked clean to the people who needed her quiet. I was 28 years old. I had a master's degree in financial analysis from Aldercroft University, a job I had earned on my own at a mid-size investment firm in Columbus, and a savings account that nobody in my family knew existed. I had never been hospitalized for anything more serious than a broken wrist at 14, when I fell from the oak tree in my grandmother's backyard trying to retrieve a kite that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a boy 2 houses down who had asked me nicely. I had never been diagnosed with a psychological disorder. I had never been in crisis. I had never, in 28 years of living, given anyone a single documented reason to question my mental competency. And yet there I was. Lakeview Behavioral Health Center. Room 14. Voluntary hold, the papers said, a phrase my family's attorney had apparently coached my parents to use because it sounded gentler than what it actually was. I had not volunteered for anything. My father had signed the emergency psychiatric hold application on a Tuesday morning while I was in my grandmother's house trying to understand why the estate attorney kept calling and why no one in my family would look me in the eye when I asked about it. If you're already feeling this story in your chest, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing who's on the other side of this. The evaluation was scheduled for Thursday at 10 in the morning. A court-appointed psychiatrist, I was told. Someone neutral, someone with no connection to my family, someone who would assess my competency and issue a report that would either confirm or deny my ability to manage my own affairs, which, in the language of what was actually happening, meant my ability to inherit. My grandmother, Edith Calloway, was 81 years old. She had been diagnosed with a slow-moving cardiac condition 14 months earlier. She was not dying imminently. She was, by every measure, sharp and present and fully herself. But she had changed her will 9 months ago. And my family had known about it for 6. I grew up in Maplewood, Ohio. The kind of town where the hardware store has been in the same family for 3 generations and everybody's kids went to the same high school and the Friday night football score determined the mood of the whole town through Sunday dinner. My parents, Richard and Carol Calloway, were not bad people in the way people imagine when they hear a story like this. They were not cruel in obvious ways. My father never raised his voice. My mother always made sure there was enough food on the table and that birthdays were remembered with a cake and a card. Ours was a house where everything looked even from the outside, and the inside was arranged with just enough precision that the imbalance was hard to name. You could feel it, though. The way you can feel a room is slightly tilted even when you can't see the slope. My brother Derek was 3 years older than me. He was the first thing my parents led with in any conversation: Derek's promotion, Derek's house in the suburbs, Derek's daughter who had started walking at 10 months. Derek was not a bad person either. He was simply a person who had been handed so much for so long that he had stopped noticing what he was holding. He coached youth soccer on weekends and brought my mother flowers on her birthday and said things like "family is everything" at Thanksgiving with a sincerity that would have been beautiful if the family he meant had included me in the same breath. The pattern started early. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way most patterns don't. It was the small things first. Derek's science fair project got a new display board from the craft store. Mine was made from a flattened cereal box and printer paper. Derek's broken bicycle was replaced within the week. My broken bicycle sat in the garage for a year before my grandmother quietly bought me a used one out of her own pocket and told my parents it was a birthday gift so nobody had to have a conversation about it. I was 9. My grandmother understood something at 9 that my parents were never going to understand. and she decided she was going to act on it instead of grieve it. Edith Calloway had spent 30 years running a property management company with my grandfather before he passed. She was the kind of woman who read contracts the way other people read novels, looking for the story inside the language, the thing being said between the lines. She had money, not obscene money, but real money, carefully built over decades, a lake house on Cedar Point worth just over $200,000, a portfolio of index funds that had grown to roughly $340,000 by the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree, and a craftsman-style house in Maplewood that the family treated like a piece of the landscape, permanent, inevitable, belonging to everyone and therefore to no one in particular. She had no debt. She had a will that, for the first 20 years of my adulthood, divided everything in clean halves between Derek and me. And then she changed it. I did not know the details until much later. What I knew at the time was that my father's demeanor toward me shifted in November of the year my grandmother revised her estate plan. He became careful with me, careful in the way people are with something fragile, not out of tenderness, but out of the fear of making a mistake before the right moment. My mother started calling me more often, asking questions about my mental health with a new and pointed interest that hadn't been there before. "How are you sleeping? Are you still seeing that therapist?" A therapist I had seen twice in graduate school for ordinary anxiety about deadlines and had stopped seeing 3 years prior. "How is work? Is it stressful? You've always been so high-strung, sweetheart." I noticed it and said nothing. I was not, at that point, afraid. I was just watchful. I had been watchful my whole life in the way that middle children and overlooked daughters learn to be, not suspicious exactly, but attentive. Aware that the room could shift without warning and that the best thing to do was to keep your eyes open and your cards flat on the table. The conversation that changed everything happened in my grandmother's kitchen on a Sunday in March. I had driven 3 hours to visit her, as I did every other month, and we were sitting at the round table she had kept since 1987, the one with the tiny burn mark near the edge from a candle that had tipped at Christmas the year my grandfather was sick. She poured coffee without asking how I took it because she had always known, a little cream, no sugar, and she set a plate of the almond cookies she made from a recipe she kept handwritten on an index card in her recipe box between the dividers marked C and D, between chicken and desserts, like it belonged to both categories at once. She told me she had changed the will. Not the broad strokes, not the percentages, but she told me there were provisions now, specific ones she wanted me to understand before her attorney began the formal process of recording the amendments. She told me that she had watched, carefully and for a very long time, the way my parents handled money, and the way Derek handled it, and that she was not comfortable leaving everything evenly distributed without structure. She said there were conditions now. Specific conditions that applied to Derek's portion that did not apply to mine. And she said that certain properties, particularly the lake house and a separate investment account she had kept in a trust since my grandfather passed, were now designated differently than they had been before. She said it quietly and clearly, the way she said everything that mattered. Then she folded her hands around her coffee cup and looked at me and said, "Your father is going to be upset. I need you to be ready for that." I told her I could handle it. She looked at me for a moment longer than the sentence required. "I know you can," she said. "I just want you to know it's coming." It came faster than either of us expected. By April, my father had hired a private attorney named Gerald Moss, not the family's regular estate attorney, a separate one, a litigation specialist, and the conversations I was having with my parents started to take on a new texture. Questions about my stability that had previously been casual started to feel like they were being documented. My mother asked me during a phone call in late April whether I had ever considered that the stress of my job might be affecting my judgment. I asked her what she meant by judgment. She said she was just worried, the way mothers worry. I said I appreciated it and ended the call and sat in my car in the parking garage outside my office building for 11 minutes without moving. In May, Derek called me for the first time in 4 months. He said he'd been thinking about me. He said he'd heard from Mom and Dad that I seemed overwhelmed. He said, And this is the sentence I will never be able to fully explain without getting something cold in my chest. Sometimes when people are under a lot of pressure, they make decisions that seem rational to them but look different from the outside. I asked him what decisions he was referring to. He said he wasn't talking about anything specific, just in general, just that he cared about me. I thanked him and got off the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time staring at the tile backsplash behind the stove. I called my grandmother. She picked up on the second ring. "They're building something," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "Theodore is aware." Theodore Marsh was her personal attorney. The one she had worked with for over a decade. The one who had drafted the new estate documents. "What are they building?" I asked. She chose her words carefully. "A case," she said. "For incompetency." And the floor of my understanding of my own family shifted an inch to the left. The paperwork came on a Tuesday. Not to me, I didn't see it until later. My father filed an emergency petition with the county probate court to have a psychological evaluation ordered on my behalf. The language in the petition, which I eventually obtained a copy of, described me as exhibiting erratic behavior, deteriorating judgment, and emotional instability that may impair her ability to manage complex financial matters. It cited, as evidence, the following: a phone call in which I had spoken irrationally about family finances, a concern raised by my brother about my apparent stress levels, and a statement from my mother that she had observed me crying without apparent cause during a family visit, a visit that had occurred 14 months earlier, at my grandfather's graveside, which I can only assume the document's author believed a jury of reasonable people would find suspicious. There was a physician's signature on the emergency hold application. A Dr. Renata Cole, a general practitioner whose office I had never visited, who had apparently agreed, on the basis of my parents' account of my behavior, that there was sufficient cause to authorize a 72-hour psychiatric hold pending full evaluation. My father signed a supporting affidavit. Gerald Moss filed it at 8 in the morning. The process server arrived at my grandmother's house at 11, where I had driven the night before because she had called me, her voice careful in a way that scared me, and said she thought it would be good for me to come. I understood later that she had been trying to warn me without frightening me. She had not understood how fast they were going to move. 2 people from Lakeview arrived at 12:30. One of them had a clipboard. The other one was kind in a practiced way, not warm, but not unkind, the way people are when their job requires them to do difficult things to people who don't understand what's happening yet. My grandmother stood at the door of her kitchen and watched them walk me out, and the expression on her face was one I have thought about almost every day since. It was not grief. It was not helplessness. It was fury, held so tightly that it had compressed itself into something else entirely, into precision, into focus, into the face of a woman who was already, in that moment, deciding exactly what she was going to do about it. Room 14. The parking lot. The plastic mattress cover that crinkled. 2 days of waiting while my family's attorney made the case to the court that I needed to be evaluated before I could be trusted with my own inheritance. My grandmother was not permitted to visit during the hold period. My parents did not attempt to. Derek sent a text that said, simply, "I hope you get the help you need." I read it once, set the phone face down on the bedside table, and did not pick it up again until Thursday morning when the knock came at the door of room 14. I said, "Come in, because what else do you say?" The door opened. A man in his 50s stepped through it, tall, slightly rumpled in the way of academics, reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair, a manila folder in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He was wearing a blue tie and a blazer that I recognized as the same shade of dark charcoal he had worn on the first day of my psychological assessment and diagnosis course at Aldercroft University, in the fall semester of my junior year, 7 years ago. He had been my professor for 4 years. He had written one of my 2 graduate school recommendation letters. He had attended my thesis defense and asked 2 of the 3 hardest questions in the room. And now he was standing in the doorway of my psychiatric evaluation room with a court order and a folder and the same slightly distracted expression he used to wear when he was about to ask you something that was going to take you much longer to answer than you thought. Dr. Marcus Webb looked at me. I looked at him. He lowered his coffee cup very slowly and very carefully, the way you lower something when you need your hands to be steady before you speak. "Nora," he said. Not Miss Calloway, not the formal version he'd been handed on a court document, just my name, the way a person says a name when they know the person it belongs to. His voice was even. His expression gave nothing away except the thing behind it, which was a recognition so clear and so complete that I felt, for the first time in 72 hours, like I was standing on ground that would hold. I looked at him and I thought about my mother's white hydrangeas and my father's careful questions and Derek's text and the clipboard in the hallway and the parking lot outside the window that faced the wrong direction, and I thought about my grandmother's face in the kitchen doorway, the fury compressed into precision, and I understood something then that I had not fully understood before. They had made a mistake. A very specific, very documentable, very irreversible mistake. And they had sent it through the door of room 14 in a blazer I recognized and carrying a cup of coffee he hadn't finished yet. Dr. Webb pulled the chair from the small desk in the corner and sat down across from me. He opened the folder. He read the court order. He read the petitioner's name, Richard Calloway, and he read my name, and then he looked up and set the folder on his knee and said the second thing he said to me in that room, which was also, as it turned out, the most important. "Tell me everything. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." There is a specific quality of silence that fills a room when someone who has spent 2 days being described as unstable suddenly begins speaking incomplete, ordered sentences with dates and dollar figures and the names of attorneys attached. I watched it happen in real time. Dr. Webb did not interrupt me once in the first 20 minutes. He sat with the folder open across his knee and a pen uncapped in his right hand, and he listened the way he had always listened in his classroom, not passively, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actively, with his whole attention arranged around what you were saying like a structure built to hold it. He had been one of those rare professors who made you feel, when you spoke in his seminar, that the thing you were saying mattered enough to be heard precisely. I had not realized, until I was sitting on a plastic-covered mattress in a psychiatric hold room trying to explain what my family had done, how much I had needed exactly that quality in exactly this person. I told him about the will. I told him about the November shift in my father's behavior, about my mother's questions, about Derek's phone call and the sentence about decisions that looked different from the outside. I told him about Gerald Moss and the litigation attorney my father had hired before he had even spoken to me directly about his concerns, which I took to be its own kind of evidence about what the concerns actually were. I told him about the physician's signature on the hold application, a Dr. Renata Cole whose office I had never visited, and I told him about the affidavit my father had signed describing my behavior as erratic and my judgment as deteriorating. I told him that the most erratic thing I had done in the preceding 6 months, to my knowledge, was cry at my grandfather's grave, and that I had done so 14 months prior, not recently, and that I had been standing next to my mother when it happened, which meant she had signed off on including it as evidence of instability while presumably standing right beside me doing the same thing. Dr. Webb wrote something at that point. I couldn't see what it was. He looked up and asked me one question: had I been treated by any mental health professional in the past 3 years? I told him the truth. 2 sessions with a graduate school counselor for deadline anxiety, concluded without any diagnosis or ongoing treatment plan, nearly 4 years ago. He wrote that down too. Then he closed the folder and looked at me with the expression I remembered from his office hours, the one that meant he had already formed a conclusion and was now deciding how plainly to say it. "The petition describes someone I have never observed," he said. "In 4 years of academic instruction, thesis advising, and a graduate recommendation process that requires me to assess a student's judgment, emotional regulation, and cognitive function, I have never seen anything in you that resembles what this document describes." He tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. I'm going to need to review the supporting materials in full. But I want you to understand what my evaluation is going to say, because you are entitled to know it and because I think someone in this building should have already told you." He paused. "You are not a danger to yourself or others. You do not exhibit signs of a psychiatric condition that would impair your ability to manage your own financial or personal affairs. There is no clinical basis for this hold, and there is no clinical basis for the competency challenge your family is pursuing." Another pause, shorter. "What there is a paper trail that tells a different story than the one your father's attorney submitted to the court. And I intend to document all of it." I sat with that for a moment. The parking lot outside the window was doing its ordinary thing. A delivery truck was backing up to the dumpster. The driver had the door open and one foot on the running board and was talking to someone on a phone, unhurried, completely unaware of what had just been said in room 14. I thought about my grandmother's face in the kitchen doorway. I thought about what she had told me 14 months ago, sitting at her round table with the burn mark near the edge. "Be ready for it," she had said. I had thought I was. I had not understood the specific shape of what was coming. Dr. Webb's evaluation took 4 hours across 2 sessions, Thursday morning and Thursday afternoon. He was thorough in the way that only people who understand the stakes of their own thoroughness can be. He administered 3 separate validated assessment instruments, documented the complete history of my contact with mental health professionals, cross-referenced the petition's stated evidence against my own account, and noted formally that he had a prior professional relationship with me as my academic instructor, which, he explained to me with a measured precision that I found both calming and slightly frightening, actually strengthened rather than compromised his position, because it gave him a longitudinal record of my functioning that no other evaluator in this context would have access to. He knew me across 4 years, across thesis stress and examination pressure and the kind of sustained cognitive demand that would surface any meaningful instability if instability existed. He had a basis for comparison that Dr. Renata Cole, who had never met me, did not have and could not claim. He filed his preliminary report Friday morning. I was released at 2 in the afternoon. My grandmother was waiting in the parking lot in her silver Buick, engine running, both hands on the wheel. She did not say anything when I got in. She reached across the console and took my hand and held it for a count of 5, and then she put the car in drive and pulled out of the Lakeview parking lot without looking back at it. We drove for 20 minutes before either of us spoke. She asked me if I was hungry. I said yes. We went to the diner on Route 9 that she had been going to since before I was born, the one with the laminated menus and the waitress named Donna who had been there so long she didn't need to write your order down, and we sat in the corner booth and ate eggs and toast and did not discuss anything important until the coffee arrived. Then my grandmother set her cup down and said, "Theodore has been busy." Theodore Marsh, her attorney. I asked her what he had been doing. She smiled, just slightly, just at the corner of her mouth, the way she smiled when she had been waiting to say something for long enough that saying it was its own reward. "Reading the petition," she said. "And then making some calls." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "Gerald Moss made a procedural error, Nora. He filed the competency challenge as an emergency action, which requires a specific standard of evidence that his submission did not meet. Theodore identified it within an hour of receiving the documents. He's filed a motion to dismiss on that basis, and he's filed a separate motion requesting that the court review the basis for the emergency psychiatric hold on grounds that the supporting physician, this Dr. Cole, does not appear to have conducted any examination of you prior to signing the application." She paused. "Which is because she didn't." Theodore checked. I stared at her. "She signed it based on your father's description alone," my grandmother said. "She never spoke to you. She never met you. She signed a document authorizing a psychiatric hold on a patient she had never seen in her life." I put my toast down. "Can she do that?" My grandmother's expression told me everything I needed to know about what Dr. Renata Cole's professional future looked like. "No," she said simply. "She cannot." I want to tell you that the week that followed was quiet. It was not quiet. Theodore Marsh filed 3 separate motions in 6 days. Gerald Moss responded to 2 of them and went silent on the third, which Theodore told my grandmother was itself informative. The one he hadn't responded to was the one requesting a full evidentiary hearing on the basis for the competency petition, and an attorney who was confident in his position responds to every motion. An attorney who knows his client's evidence won't survive scrutiny goes quiet and starts making phone calls. The phone call my father made was to me. It came on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after I had been released from Lakeview. I was in my apartment in Columbus, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a copy of Theodore's motion to dismiss, which he had sent me as a courtesy so I understood what was being argued on my behalf. My father's name came up on the screen and I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. He said my name. I said hello. There was a pause that had the texture of a man who has rehearsed a conversation and found, at the moment of delivery, that the rehearsed version no longer applies. He said he thought we should talk. I said I agreed. He said he wanted to explain. I told him I was listening. And then he said the thing he said, which was, I was trying to protect the family, Nora. Your grandmother is not well. People take advantage of elderly people. It happens all the time. I was worried about undue influence. I held the phone and looked at my kitchen wall and thought very carefully about my next sentence. You filed a psychiatric hold application, I said, based on a physician's signature from a doctor who had never examined me, in order to have me declared incompetent to inherit from a grandmother who is, by every documented measure, fully competent herself and who changed her own will of her own volition without any pressure from me. A pause. I know how it looks, he said. And I thought, there it is. Not I was wrong. Not I shouldn't have done it. I know how it looks. A man who had spent his entire adult life managing appearances describing a moral catastrophe in the language of optics. I'm not going to talk to you without Theodore present, I said. I ended the call. I sat there for a while. Then I called my grandmother and told her what he'd said. She listened without interrupting and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Good. Theodore needs to hear that he called you. I asked why. She said, because your father just made unsolicited contact with you while an active legal motion regarding his conduct is pending in probate court. A pause. Theodore is going to enjoy that. The family gathering was my father's idea. He proposed it through Derek, which should have told me everything I needed to know about how confident he was in his own position. Men who believe they hold the stronger hand do not send their brothers to negotiate a meeting, they call directly. Derek reached out 11 days before the scheduled hearing on Theodore's motion to dismiss, and he framed it, carefully, as a chance for the family to get ahead of things, to talk through everything together, to find a way forward that didn't require a courtroom. He said grandmother would want them all in the same room. He said it could be at her house, neutral ground, everybody together. I told Derek I would be there. I told him I would be bringing Theodore. He said that seemed like it was escalating things unnecessarily. I said I disagreed and asked him what time. The gathering was set for a Sunday afternoon in late October. My grandmother's house. The round kitchen table wouldn't fit everyone, so she set up the dining room, the good table, the one that was only used for Christmas and funerals and the occasional dinner party she threw in the years when my grandfather was still alive and she still had the energy to cook for 10 people without it being a production. She put white hydrangeas in the center of the table, which I noticed immediately and which I am certain was not an accident, because my grandmother understood symbolism the way she understood real estate. Every detail was a decision, and every decision meant something. My father arrived first with my mother. He was wearing a pressed shirt, which was his version of armor. My mother had her composure on so tightly it looked structural, like if you removed it she would simply cease to have a shape. Derek came with his wife, Sandra, who had the expression of someone who had been briefed on the basic situation and was now hoping to be left out of it. Gerald Moss arrived 4 minutes after Derek, which confirmed that he had been coming all along and that the framing of this as an informal family conversation had been, from the beginning, something other than that. Theodore Marsh arrived with me. He was 70 years old and wore a bow tie and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been to more courtrooms than most judges, and he walked into my grandmother's dining room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had read every document in this situation and found the opposing argument wanting. My grandmother sat at the head of the table. She had dressed for the occasion, a dark green blouse I had seen her wear to exactly 2 events in my lifetime, both of them significant ones. She had her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a glass of water in front of her and her hands folded on the table, and she looked, I thought, like a woman who has been waiting a very long time for a conversation she has already decided the outcome of. My father opened. He was good at opening, he had a banker's instinct for framing, for setting the terms of an exchange before anyone else could. He said he was glad everyone was there, that he hoped they could approach this as a family, that the most important thing to everyone in the room was clearly Edith's well-being and the integrity of her wishes. He said that his concerns about undue influence were sincere and documented, that the psychiatric evaluation, and here he looked at me, briefly, with an expression that was trying to be compassionate, had been intended not as an attack but as a precaution, a way to ensure that everyone involved could be confident in the decisions being made around the estate. He said he understood it had been upsetting. He said he was sorry it had come to this. He said he hoped they could resolve it without further legal proceedings. He said all of that, and it was fluent and it was structured and it landed in the room with the smooth authority of a man who had practiced it carefully, and when he was done there was a moment of almost complete stillness in which my mother nodded very slightly and Derek looked at his hands and Sandra looked at the hydrangeas and Gerald Moss uncapped his pen and my grandmother did not move at all. Then I opened my folder. Not dramatically. Not with a gesture designed to be noticed. I simply set it on the table in front of me and opened it, the way you open something when you have had it ready for a long time and the moment has finally arrived for it to be read. My father's eyes went to it immediately. Gerald Moss's eyes went to it. Theodore folded his hands and looked at nothing in particular with an expression of polite patience. I have the psychiatric evaluation, I said. My voice was even. Quieter than I expected it to be, given what I was holding. Dr. Marcus Webb's full report, filed with the probate court on Friday the 14th. I slid the first copy across the table, not to my father, to Gerald Moss, because Gerald Moss was the one who needed to read it, and because my father had been going to Gerald Moss for authority this whole time, and I wanted him to watch where that authority landed now. Moss picked it up. He read the first page. He turned to the second. His pen stopped moving. My father was watching Moss. The way a man watches the person he's put in charge of something when that something starts to look wrong. Dr. Webb's report finds no clinical basis for the psychiatric hold, I said. No diagnosis. No evidence of impaired judgment, emotional dysregulation, or compromised cognitive function. His clinical opinion is that the petition's described behaviors are inconsistent with his 4 years of direct professional observation of me and inconsistent with any validated diagnostic criteria. I let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. He also notes, in Section 4, that the emergency hold application appears to have been executed without a direct examination of the patient by the authorizing physician, which he identifies as a significant procedural concern that he has reported to the state medical board. My mother made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound, the kind that happens when the air leaves a room faster than the body can adjust to it. Gerald Moss set the report down and looked at my father with an expression that had nothing personal in it, nothing sympathetic, just the flat, precise look of a professional who has just calculated the distance between where they are and where they need to be and found it very large. My father looked at me. His composure was intact, technically, but intact in the way a wall is intact after the foundation has shifted, still standing, but no longer connected to anything that would keep it standing. Nora, he said. I was trying to protect this family. I looked at him across the white hydrangeas and the good tablecloth and my grandmother's hands folded at the head of the table, and I said the thing I had been carrying for 14 months, the thing that was true and provable and had cost me 72 hours in a room with a window facing the wrong direction. You were protecting Derek's inheritance. Not the family. Not grandmother. Not me. 7 words, then 4 more. There is a difference. The dining room held its breath. Derek looked up from his hands for the first time since my father had stopped speaking. Sandra's eyes went to Derek. Moss was looking at his legal pad. Theodore was still looking at nothing in particular, but the corner of his mouth had moved an almost imperceptible fraction of an inch to the right. My grandmother unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table, a gesture I had seen her make at the close of a deal, the gesture that means, we are done negotiating the terms. Now we are simply stating the result. Gerald, she said. Not to my father. To Moss. Because she understood, as she had always understood, who the operational center of a plan was, and it was not the man who believed in it, it was the man who had been paid to make it work. Your client's petition will be heard in 11 days. Theodore will be moving for dismissal on 3 separate grounds, the third of which involves the conduct of Dr. Cole, whose medical license is currently under review. She said it without drama, without triumph, without any of the heat the moment had earned. I would encourage you to advise your client accordingly. Moss capped his pen. He placed the psychiatric evaluation into his own folder with the careful movements of a man who has decided that the meeting is over and is in the process of determining how to exit it professionally. My father started to say something. Moss put a hand up, just slightly, just enough, and my father stopped. The withdrawal came 4 days later. Gerald Moss filed a notice with the probate court withdrawing the competency petition in full. No explanation given, no admission of error, just the clean procedural language of a retreat. Theodore called me when it was filed and read it to me over the phone, and when he was done he said, in the same measured tone he used for everything, "That's the end of that." I thanked him. He said he would send my grandmother the updated case status and that I should enjoy the rest of my week. He sounded, I thought, like a man who had enjoyed his own week considerably. Dr. Renata Cole received a formal notice of investigation from the State Medical Board within 3 weeks of Dr. Webb's report. The investigation concerned the appropriateness of authorizing a psychiatric hold without direct patient examination. I did not follow every step of that process. What I know is that her practice was placed under a compliance review and that she was required to complete a supervised retraining program before her prescribing privileges were fully restored. Whether she understood the weight of what she had signed or whether she had simply trusted my father's account without asking enough questions, I cannot say. What I can say is that a signature carries its own consequence regardless of intention, and that she had learned that in a way she was unlikely to forget. Gerald Moss closed his file on our case and sent my father a final invoice that Derek mentioned, obliquely, in a text the following month, the first text he had sent me since the one that said he hoped I got the help I needed. The invoice was not a small number. It covered emergency filing fees, court appearances, correspondence with opposing counsel, and the administrative work of withdrawing a petition that should never have been filed. My father paid it from his savings account. I know this because Derek told me, in the same oblique text, that he was upset about it and had said so to Derek, which was Derek's way of telling me something was happening without saying he was telling me something was happening. I read the text twice, then set my phone down and went back to what I was doing, which was my actual work, at my actual desk, using my actual judgment, in a life that had not required any psychiatric intervention from any member of my family. The morning after the withdrawal was filed, I drove to my grandmother's house. Not for any particular reason, not because anything needed to be done, but because I had spent 72 hours in a room facing the wrong direction and I had been wanting, since the moment I walked out of it, to sit at her kitchen table with the burn mark near the edge and drink coffee the way she made it and be in a room where I did not have to explain myself to anyone. She was already in the kitchen when I arrived. She had known I was coming. She always knew when I was coming. She had made the almond cookies, the ones from the index card between C and D, and she set the plate between us without ceremony and poured the coffee without asking how I took it, because she had never needed to ask. We sat there for a long time. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard was losing its leaves in the slow, untroubled way of something that has done this before and knows it will do it again. My grandmother picked up one of the cookies and held it for a moment without eating it. Then she said, quietly, "Your grandfather used to say that the test of a plan isn't the plan. It's the person." She put the cookie down. "Your father made a plan." She picked her coffee cup up. "But he didn't know who he was dealing with. And he didn't know who Dr. Webb was." She looked at me across the table. "I did," she said. "I looked him up when you started at Aldercroft. I read his published work. I knew what kind of man he was before your father ever thought to make a phone call." She sipped her coffee. "I didn't know they would send him specifically. That was luck, or something like it. But I knew that if they were going to try something like this, the truth would hold. Because you hold." She set her cup down. "You always have." I looked at my grandmother, 81 years old, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, a woman who had spent 30 years reading contracts and another 20 watching her family and who had changed her will 9 months ago because she understood, with the same precision she brought to everything, exactly what she was protecting and exactly how much it was worth. "Thank you," I said. She shook her head. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just remember it." A pause, a short one. "And eat the cookie. I made them this morning." 6 months after Gerald Moss withdrew the petition, Dr. Marcus Webb was recognized by the Ohio Board of Psychological Examiners for his conduct during the Lakeview evaluation. The recognition was not a medal or a ceremony, it was a formal letter entered into his professional record acknowledging that his report had served as a corrective instrument in a case involving the misuse of psychiatric evaluation as a legal mechanism. He told me about it over coffee near the Aldercroft campus, where he still taught Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He had reached out in November, a brief email, asking if I would be willing to meet. I said yes without deliberating. We sat in the same campus coffee shop where I had gone between his Thursday seminars 7 years earlier, and he ordered the same black coffee he had always ordered, and he told me that in 31 years of clinical and academic work he had never filed a report he was more certain of. I told him I was grateful. He said what he had done was simply his job done correctly, which was, I thought, exactly the kind of thing a person says when they understand that doing your job correctly is not always simple and not always without cost and is worth saying plainly anyway. Theodore Marsh settled the estate amendments formally in December. The lake house was titled into a trust with my name as sole beneficiary. The investment account, $342,000, as of the December statement, was restructured with a distribution schedule Theodore had designed to minimize exposure and maximize my control over the timing. Derek received his portion under the original terms, which were generous, because my grandmother was a generous woman and had not changed that part, only the structure around it. He did not contest anything. He called me once, in January, and said he was sorry. Not a long call, not a detailed one, just the word, plainly, without qualifications attached to it. I said I heard him. I told him I needed time. He said he understood. We have not spoken since, but the door is not locked. It is simply not yet open, and I am the one who will decide when that changes. My father did not call again after the withdrawal was filed. My mother called twice, once in November, once in February, and both calls had the careful, circling quality of a person looking for a way into a conversation they don't quite know how to begin. The November call ended without either of us saying what we meant. The February call went slightly further. She told me she hadn't understood, when she signed the affidavit, what it would mean in practice, that she had believed my father when he told her it was a protective measure, a formality, something the attorney had said was standard in contested estate situations. I listened to that and I tried to decide what I believed about it, and I found that I believed some of it and not all of it, and that the part one didn't believe wasn't the part she was saying, it was the part she wasn't saying, which was that she had also simply wanted Derek to be taken care of, and that wanting had made it easier not to ask the harder questions. I told her I understood more than she might think. I told her that understanding was not the same as being ready, and that I would call her when I was. She said okay. She has not pushed since, which is perhaps the most honest thing she has done in this entire process. I wrote Dr. Webb a letter by hand in March. Not a long one, 3 paragraphs, written on the good stationery I kept in my desk for things that mattered enough to be written by hand. I told him what his report had meant, not as a legal document but as a human act, the act of a person who knew me and told the truth about what he knew in a room where telling the truth cost him something, because it meant standing against the narrative that had been constructed and paid for and submitted to a court. I told him that for 72 hours I had sat in room 14 of a psychiatric facility and wondered whether there was a version of events in which what my family had built would hold, in which the paperwork would outrun the truth. And that when he walked through that door and said my name the way a person says the name of someone they actually know, I understood that the truth had been there the whole time. It had just needed someone willing to say it out loud in a place where it would be recorded. He wrote back. 4 lines, his handwriting careful and slightly slanted, the same handwriting from 7 years of margin notes on my thesis drafts. He said the truth doesn't require courage when you've been paying attention. He said I had always been worth paying attention to. He said he hoped the coffee had been worth the drive. It had been. It always was. I am 30 years old now. I still work in Columbus. I was promoted in the spring, senior analyst, my own portfolio of accounts, a corner office that faces a park instead of a parking lot, which I notice every morning and which I have not yet stopped being quietly grateful for. The lake house on Cedar Point is mine. I have not sold it. I drove out there in the spring when the ice came off the water and the birches along the shoreline were just beginning to show green, and I sat on the dock with my feet above the water and tried to feel what I expected to feel, which was triumph, and found instead something quieter and more durable, which was simply the feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. My grandmother is 82. She still makes the almond cookies from the index card between C and D. She still pours coffee without asking how you take it because she has always known, and she still sits at the round kitchen table with the burn mark near the edge and says the things that matter in the plainest sentences she can find for them. Last Sunday she told me that the hardest thing about loving people is watching them choose smallness when you know they are capable of more. She was talking about my father. She was also, I think, talking about herself, about the years she watched the imbalance in my family and chose patience over confrontation, trusting the structure she had built to hold when it was needed. I don't know if she was right to wait as long as she did. I know she was right about the structure. I know she was right about me. Here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I would tell anyone who has sat in a room where the people who were supposed to protect them had decided instead to use them. They built their case on the assumption that being quiet meant being empty. That because I had never made a scene, never demanded, never staged the kind of confrontation that would have given them something visible to point to, I had nothing. No ground. No proof. No one who knew me well enough to stand in a room and say, simply, that is not who she is. They forgot, or perhaps they never understood, that quiet people are not people without witnesses. They are people whose witnesses have been watching for a long time and have seen enough to know exactly what the truth looks like. Dr. Webb walked through that door because my family sent him there. They paid the filing fees that put his name on the court order. They chose the facility. They set the date. And in doing all of that, they handed me the one thing their entire plan had been designed to take away, an unimpeachable record, signed and notarized and entered into the official proceedings of a probate court, stating clearly and professionally and without any ambiguity at all that I was exactly who I had always been. They built the room. They just forgot to check who they were putting in it. I still have the copy of the evaluation report. It is in the top drawer of my desk at home, next to my grandmother's most recent letter and a parking stub from Lakeview that I kept without entirely knowing why. I look at it sometimes, not often, just occasionally, the way you look at something that once frightened you and no longer can, because the thing it was built on turned out not to hold. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story stayed with you, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you'll find something there that hits just as close. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I'll see you in the next story.